All right, PD Newman is with us in Grimerica. Thanks for joining us. How are you?
Oh, great. Thanks for having me. Glad to be
Oh,
here.
oh yeah, this will be a blast. I mean, we're going to talk about your latest book. I guess it's coming out soon, is it?
March 11th. Yeah.
March 11th. Okay, so a couple weeks. Yeah, just under 2 weeks
Two
probably.
weeks. Yeah.
And yeah, which is about the mounds and stuff. We'll get into that because we have a trip. I think we're gonna actually we don't have. I don't know if we've talked about it publicly, have we, Darren? But we're gonna do a trip with Randall around the mounds, so that might be a fun way to connect with you physically. But I hope you're okay of me asking some sort of big picture, like deeper questions too, because after learning a little bit about you, I'm fascinated to ask you a whole bunch of stuff. So
Sure, man.
yeah,
I'm an open book.
yeah, this is gonna be a blast. I guess let's start. I mean, let's start with your book, the latest book coming out. Like you've been writing and talking about psychedelics for a while, and you combine that with the mounds in Mississippi. Is it? So what? How did you come about that, and what kind of evidence have you found for that?
Well, so not just in Mississippi, but the Mississippians, which
Oh, right,
were
right.
natives that occupied the southeastern part of the continent, in and around the Mississippi Valley. Um, and they are the successors to the Hopewell
Okay.
temporally.
Yeah.
Uh, and the way I got into it, I had just published my book on theurgy, which is the book I published prior to this one. And I was talking to a gentleman at a conference in where were we? In Yorkshire. A guy named Brian Murarescu. He's the author of The Immortality Key.
Yeah.
And I was telling him about the model of soul ascent in theurgy, which is theurgy is a kind of a ritualized application of Platonic metaphysics.
Yeah. I
And
wanted to ask for your definition on that, actually.
sure, we can get into that.
Yeah.
And I was overheard describing this by a couple of gentlemen who were having a discussion from us, which were Dennis McKenna and Graham Hancock. And Graham turned around and said, "Oh, you're talking about the path of souls, the Native American path of souls." I said, "No, I'm talking about Greek soul ascent." I said, "But no, I'm not talking about the path of souls." And he said, "Well, everything I heard you say uh, applies to the path of souls." So my interest was immediately piqued, and I pulled out my phone and got on Amazon and started looking for any books on the path of souls. And I stumbled upon a book with the title Path of Souls, and it turned out to be written by this gentleman named Gregory Little that lives in Memphis, Tennessee, which is about an hour from me.
Yeah. I've seen a lot of his posts on X about mounds and mound
Yeah,
building.
yeah. So, I read his book. He and I connected. He showed me around some mound sites in Memphis that I wasn't familiar with, and yeah, it just grabbed my attention, and I couldn't stop. I started from the basics. When this research started emerging from academics, and I kept coming upon references and images and things that I thought could be suggestive of psychedelic use, but I try not to fall into that confirmation bias because that's already my background, and I try to meet what I'm researching on its own terms. But sure enough, I started getting into analyses of botanical assemblages that were recovered from these mound sites, and they'd almost always contain all of these different plants that are hallucinogenic, that have psychedelic potential. And the the big revelation was that there was clear potential for the use of an ayahuasca analog, which is really surprising. It's kind of, if that's true, that's a really big deal because ayahuasca has, you know, it's, we'll back up. Ayahuasca is a hallucinogenic tea. It's used by the indigenous of the Amazon and by different people. Now it's, it's gotten pretty big, but it originates in South America. So it's never been known to have been used here outside of it being imported from there. But evidence is pretty good that there was. And I tentatively term this in the book Misahuasca. Maybe after we learn more about it and get some more research under our belts, we'll come up with a better term for what this stuff was. But yeah, so
what were the plants? What were the plants? Or what was it derived from? What plants was it derived from?
So traditionally, ayahuasca is a combination of two plants or more, but basics are two plants, one of which contains NN-DMT, and this generally comes from Psychotria viridis, Diplopterus cabrerana in some cases, and it has to be, in most cases, it has to be combined with a monoamine oxidase inhibitor to render it orally active, because DMT under normal circumstances isn't orally active. It breaks down in the gut before it ever makes it into the bloodstream. So it's mixed with a secondary plant traditionally, which is Banisteriopsis caapi. And this is a vine that contains a substance called harmine that is a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. And the combination of these two renders an incredibly potent visionary tea that's used ritually in South America. Well, these plants don't grow here. So it's another reason it's never really been considered that a substance like that could have been used here. But the research shows that they were very familiar with and were boiling the roots of and likely consuming the roots of this tree. It used to be classified as Acacia americana.
Yeah, I was going to ask if it was acacia.
It is. It's an acacia. It's been reclassified now as Gleditsia triacanthos. But even that acan and acanthos, that root is the same root that acacia comes from. So acacia is still implied in the name, but it's now called Gleditsia triacanthos and more popularly known as honey locust. And the source for the MAOI, there are three very promising candidates, all three of which we know that they were using. One of which is the Yaupon holly, which is Ilex vomitoria. And this substance is already known to have been used on its own. It's the only native source of caffeine in North America, but there's also evidence that it contains small amounts of monoamine oxidase inhibitors.
Wow.
And they were boiling this stuff up at such concentrations that in the literature, it's described as being syrupy. So even though the amount of the drug is small in those concentrated doses, it could have contributed to activating DMT. The other two plants are Nicotiana rustica, which is the type of tobacco that was used by the natives in this region. It contains large amounts of beta carbolines, monoamine oxidase inhibitors. And the second is Passiflora incarnata, which is passion flower. And it contains, we've experimented with passion flower as an additive in ayahuasca analogs, and it's absolutely capable of activating the DMT.
And you've distilled acacia yourself too, right? And got DMT out of it
many times, yes.
So that's a real thing for people. That's been referenced back going thousands of years ago. Basically, people have been using that.
Well, this in particular, or acacia
in general.
Like, there's evidence for the psychedelic use of acacia at least as early as Zalsamos of Panopolis, which I believe is 4th century, 5th century, in Roman Egypt.
Is that Zosimo? Is that where Zozo Zeppelin 4 or Zeppelin, you know, that Zozo
Yeah,
on Zeppelin? Is that
Zozo.
where it comes from?
I don't think so,
It's a different Zozo. Okay.
but you know, there's no telling what was going on in Jimmy Page's mind when he came up with that term. That would, but you know, I've heard lots of different explanations for what that means and what he was aiming at with that, and it's possible, you know.
Yeah, I haven't paid attention to the symbols that spell that either. There's probably some symbolic meaning in that, but I haven't thought about that for so long. I just yeah.
He was very involved in occultism at the time. You know, he famously bought Boleskine in Scotland, which is
Yeah.
where Crowley
Yeah.
uh, famously performed uh, a number of
On,
his infamous rituals.
on the lock too, wasn't it? I mean, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, that's crazy in itself. And I mean, and I love that stick, the actual artwork of that sort of hermit with the sticks, like almost like
yeah.
a wizard, like
From the tarot, it's
yeah,
the
from the
Hermit card
tarot.
from
Yeah, the
the
hermit card from the tarot. Yeah,
specifically from the Rider Waite.
yeah, the Rider Waite deck.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's the one right in the corner up there, I guess. Yeah,
Yeah, the one designed
yeah.
by a lady who was unrecognized for decades and is finally getting some recognition. A lady named Pamela Coleman Smith. I believe she was Jamaican.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just reading the Book of Thoth right now. Actually, it's pretty interesting
Crowley's.
too. Yeah,
Yeah, that's a fun
yeah,
one.
yeah.
If you know his terminology and are familiar with the language he's using, that one can be a lot of fun.
Yeah, yeah. So back to the okay, I guess back to the mounds and the interesting. I can't believe that that this has been found and they've been doing that. So how do you connect that to the path of souls then?
So the Path of Souls is an afterlife model. It's where the Mississippians believed that the soul could go upon death. It didn't just go there. You had this was secret knowledge, and it was limited to initially to chiefs and the elite of these societies, and eventually it didn't so much become the knowledge of common folk, but it developed into a situation where the ones who did have that knowledge started offering their services to the family of deceased persons to act as guides and were guiding the soul to this. And the Path of Souls is what we recognize as the Milky Way galaxy. And there's a particular portal, an entrance way that allows the soul to get on this path of souls, and that's part of the secret knowledge that was transmitted in the initiatory rituals that took place in and around the mound sites. So the rituals themselves were like virtual training for what the soul was expected to do upon death if it wanted to make it to this happy afterlife kind of situation. And the portal, you'll see it in the literature called an ogi or an ogi, and which is just it's a it's a term used to describe a particular shape that is sort of like a stylized vesica piscis, like the Jesus fish shape, kind of. And it's located in the constellation that we recognize as Orion. But of course, the Orion is a Greek convention, but the natives still recognize that same cluster of stars as being a sacred cluster,
Wow.
but they saw it as they call it the chief's hand or the hand constellation. And it in the portal, which is actually Messier 42, it's the Orion Nebula that isn't visible to us today with all the light pollution, but back then you'd have been able to see it pretty clearly. And that's the point of entry, that the soul would launch itself as an arrow in this, and that would give them access to the Milky Way galaxy. So
Wow.
if you want to visualize it, you can imagine the geocentric model of astrology, with the Earth here at the center of, and the planets moving in the ecliptic, like this, rising in the east and setting in the west, just like we see the sun do. So this ecliptic is going this way, and the Milky Way is going this way. So there are 2 points at which the ecliptic intersects with the Milky Way, and one of those points is in and around the Orion constellation.
Wow. That's interesting that there's some confirmation on that too.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we see in the Greek model. Also, if you look at Porphyry's his commentary on Homer, where he describes what's called the Cave of the Nymphs, Porphyry interprets this cave as being a world, and there are 2 entrances to this cave, and those 2 entrances he describes as being located in 2 particular signs. And Porphyry's using a very kind of obscure model called, that I won't go too much into, but what he's done is fixed it so that the points of intersection are wrong. You see it actually correctly spelled out in texts like Manilius. There's another one that clearly spells it out. But the point being, Porphyry was including what you might call a blind in his text. But for anyone who was aware of this early what's called the Thema Mundi model, you could have easily discerned the proper points where they actually do intersect. But the model is still identical, which is, it just blows my mind that, people, and there's allegedly no communication between these 2 continents, and people in Greece are imagining an afterlife situation that is virtually identical to what Native Americans in the Southeast were imagining.
Did they have the equivalent of the Hades too, and like to stay away from the underworld, or
they did, yeah. So it's a similar 3-tiered model. So in Greece, we've got the middle realm where we exist, then there's Mount Olympus where only the gods live, and then there's Hades in the below world, that's policed by Cerberus, this hellhound, right, that keeps people who don't belong there from getting in, and keeps people who are in from getting out. Well, you don't have a hellhound, but you have the same 3-tiered model. In the below world, there is what they call an underwater panther. He has different names depending on the tribe. The one name I think is interesting is Missipeshu, which shares the same root as Mississippi. And if you know anything about the folklore here, to this day, there's claims of sightings of these black panthers with enormously long tails that show up in Mississippi, and that's actually left over from these early Native American myths. But this underwater panther is what polices the below world. So yeah, it's
and
very
also legends of underground caverns and like Kentucky, for example. Is that part of the Mississippi Valley, or
the Kentucky? The natives were in that area, the same natives. That's right. That feeds into even more recent occultism with there's a tradition of what are called Rosicrucian novels, and one of the most famous is called Edidorpa.
We've done the audio version of that.
You have? Okay.
Yeah, it's good. We've got it out on like YouTube and Audible and everywhere for people.
Well, so that it's from drinking the juice of a fungus out of a shell that causes this visionary journey. But the man who wrote it, John Uri Lloyd, was a famous pharmacist and pharmacognosist, and what he was doing out there was he would wander around looking for plants that could be used as drugs. And he gives one of the earliest descriptions also of, are you familiar with mad honey, hallucinogenic honey?
No.
Okay, well, if honey is made from the pollen of rhododendron flowers, then it's intoxicating, and it's used in a number of different regions, but it has a compound in it that renders it intoxicating called granotoxin. And this same substance is in a very peculiar plant that grows around here called ghost pipe. It has no chlorophyll in it. There's stark white flowers that grow on the liminal space between root structures of trees and mycorrhizal mushrooms that grow on those root structures. But it also contains the same compound, and he famously called it andromedotoxin. So John Uri Lloyd is a fascinating character.
Was there any, I mean, I know there's the whole mythology of that and the rumors around it being an actual, secret society and that whole thing being real. I mean, is there any thought to that at all? Or?
Well, that comes from the fact that the language that the man that initiates the person who finds his way into the cave, the things he's saying are taken directly out of Masonic ritual. Right. So it is real insofar it's based on Masonic language, but as far as there being
an actual guy.
A Rosicrucian order connected with the cave or with Kentucky, that I don't think so.
Right. Yeah, it's a fascinating book. So what culture are we talking about then that's making this psychedelic in the mounds? Like, is this what kind of culture is this then?
The Mississippians. It shows up in a number of different tribes. The one that gives us the most evidence are the Cherokee.
Okay.
And the ethnographies specifically preserved by James Mooney, who was also an important figure for Southwestern Native Americans, in that he was documenting the peyote ceremonies and fighting for their right to use peyote as a sacrament. And he preserved in his ethnographies descriptions of the honey locust, the thorns, the boiling of the roots. In particular, you can look up what he calls the gambler myth, where we see it. But it goes beyond just the ethnographic and archaeological literature, because there's a recent scientific study that was published not too long ago, a decade, I think, at the most. This botanist was noting the odd, the oddly dense population of honey locust trees, particularly around Cherokee sites and the mounds occupied by the Cherokee. And he says in the article that it far exceeds the tree's ordinary rate and range of dispersal. And he says that this is clear evidence that these things were being cultivated intentionally in these spaces by the Cherokee. He says it's hard to visit a mound site or a sacred site that was sacred to the Cherokee and not at any place on the land not be within a stone's throw distance of a honey locust tree. And I found this to be true also, even beyond just the Cherokee. I have yet to visit a mound site in Mississippi or Alabama where I did not find honey locust trees growing on or around the mounds. There's one mound here in Mississippi called Ingomar Mound that is completely surrounded by them. And if you're familiar with the trees, they produce these clusters of enormous, just formidable thorns that can grow up to a foot long. And it makes you wonder, did it also serve as a kind of fortress to keep people out of the mounds from trying to get into them, because they are vicious thorns on these trees.
That's fascinating.
And
Darren,
it's
you got
psychedelic,
Say that again.
and they have psychedelic properties.
Yes, and the root bark. And that's another reason I think this hasn't been picked up by mainstream archaeologists and historians, because there are no scientific studies on it, no journals discussing it. It only occurs, to my knowledge, in one source, and that source is not an academic source. It's a psychedelic source. It's a man that called himself Keeper of the Trout. And once they found that acacia was possessed of DMT, he took it upon himself to start testing other trees that were closely related, like mimosa and honey locust. These all usually have thorns and the same bipinnate compound leaf structure. And so he was visually finding these apparently related species and then testing them. And sure enough, he found that within the roots of honey locust was NN-DMT.
wow.
Mm-hmm.
That's fascinating.
What's the honey like? Then you mentioned intoxicating effects of the honey. What is that like? How intoxicating is it? Like a sort of, what I'm trying to picture what that might be like.
Well, the honey isn't from the honey locust. It gets that name because the seed pods are this. They have a sap in them that's sweet, that it's sugary. But the honey itself, that is the mad honey. In Turkey, they call it deli bal. It just looks like honey, and you like traditionally and natural. They'll use it in a natural medicinal context, in addition to using it to get intoxicated. But men, in particular, will stir it into their morning tea or coffee and drink it to give them a little vigor for the day. It's also used to treat impotence in those same cultures. It's even been used in warfare, where it was given to the opposing party and to get them intoxicated. There's a famous story. If you look up intoxicating honey and warfare, I'm sure you'll find it. But if you take enough of it, it absolutely wipes you out. You can't walk, you can't see straight, you're spinning. It causes a tingling kind of feeling all over your body. And that's the first indication that you probably slow down. If you exceed that tingling sensation, then you're about to enter sick territory.
The portal to the Milky Way.
Yeah, pretty much.
So how come after all these ancient wisdom books I've read and just getting into the sort of the bigger picture, like, because I heard a lot of people talking about Marescu's book a while back, I guess, after he was on Rogan, probably.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, I don't know, and I haven't read it myself, so I don't know, but I just haven't come across a lot of evidence in the books I've read of psychedelic use. Is it just hidden? Is it hard to find, or how come I haven't read a lot about it?
Well, in the books that aren't from the eras that this stuff was going on, the scholars aren't being paid. They're not getting funded to find examples of drugs being used. And for a long time, they thought that they weren't being used. But the first people to enter this research domain to really change people's minds on this were Albert Hoffman, the man who discovered the hallucinogenic effects of LSD, along with Carl A.P. Ruck, who is a classicist, and R. Gordon Wasson, who is the father of ethnomycology, of the use of mushrooms, not as intoxicants, but all kinds of mushrooms. He and his wife, Valentina, were just fascinated, verging on obsessed with the use of mushrooms, because he had a theory that some cultures are mycophobic, and those cultures, it doesn't matter if they're edible mushrooms, if they're intoxicating mushrooms, they're all treated as though they're poisonous. And that's largely the case in the US. Until my son, for example, who loves foraging mushrooms, we do every year, but until he was old enough to distinguish them, I told him the same thing. Don't touch them, definitely don't put them in your mouth, because there are some that will kill you if you consume them. And there's even one that you don't even have to consume it. It doesn't grow here. I think it's limited to Japan. But just touching it, the literature says it can shrink your brain. So there's some very dangerous components to fungi. But Wasson was fascinated by these two approaches, the mycophobic and the mycophilic. Other cultures, like where his wife was from, she was Russian, this didn't exist. They were very knowledgeable on mushrooms, and they foraged them every year. And there's a famous story on their honeymoon. They're walking somewhere, and she sees all these different edible and medicinal species of mushrooms, and gets overexcited and starts picking them and eating some of them. And Wasson saying, "What are you doing?" He's panicking, thinking, "Oh my God, my new bride is gonna kill herself," But she was raised in a culture where that wasn't the case. But these three researchers, the first thing that really pointed their laser at was the Eleusinian mysteries, where a substance was drunk called kykeon, and it's always been kind of a mystery in general for modern academics as to how year after year, thousands upon thousands of people could go through this ceremony and come out absolutely changed, come out having had a legitimate religious experience. I mean, normally you would have to be predisposed to something like that for a ritual to affect you in that way, and you come out illuminated, changed person.
But unless it was like a 3-day resurrection type thing. I mean, a lot of them seem to be three intense days in a dark cave getting scared to hell,
That was one interpretation that ran for a long time with the Lucis, but that turns out that wasn't the case. They're not. Okay. They weren't led underground in this darkened. The rituals took place at a small temple-like building called the Telesterion, and they would still come out year after year, all of these people having this experience. So the question was, how do you reliably induce an experience like this consistently in all of these people?
Yeah.
And the research that was coming out of Harvard with the Good Friday experiment, for example, which sought to determine whether or not psychedelics could reliably induce a religious experience in someone who believed that such was possible. So the experiment was done on theology students, and B, were in a setting that was conducive to that kind of thing. So the experiment was done on Good Friday in a chapel. And what they found was, I think Leary says something like 94%. That might be high, but I don't think so. A very high number of people who take psychedelics that are already believe in what religious activity they're participating in and are in a situation that's conducive to it, which is basically
Set and setting, right?
Set and setting. That's right. Which set and setting is just the
Maybe the
academic.
ultimate. I mean, that might be the ultimate set and setting. I mean,
Yeah. And set and setting is just the academic rediscovery of ritual.
That's that's fascinating. Yeah. And I guess I shouldn't say I've never read about it. I mean, there's Soma and there's the healing temples and there's all kinds of stuff like that too. I mean, you know, probably read about it in some of the initiations as well, but it just seemed to be missing a little bit. But yeah, that's a great example though. Yeah.
But there were lots of drugs used in ancient Greece. Opium was used beyond just its medicinal capabilities. Cannabis was used, belladonna, mandrake, likely datura, very sophisticated approach to intoxication. And there's even evidence that they were using things, you know, poisons from certain animals and toxins.
Ergot and
Ergot. That was the trio of researchers that we were just discussing. That's what they settled on as the likely solution, because ergot is the source. It's the precursor for LSD, and the telesterion at Eleusis is adjacent to the Rarian plain where barley was grown, and ergot infests barley. So that's what led them to hypothesize that ergot was likely what was being used to induce that. And lots of people disagree with that. Tom Hatsis, for example, he doesn't think that's a viable solution. But there was a discovery at a temple in Italy, a temple that was dedicated to the same goddesses that were central to the Eleusinian mysteries.
Wow.
Where they found these vase containers that were used to mix wine, to make wine and age wine. They tested the residues and found ergot in the residues. And they also found the remains of an individual and found ergot in his dental calculus. So that's a supporting evidence that ergot could have been what was used at the Eleusinian mysteries. But I think Hatsis, he thinks it was more likely opium. I don't know that I agree with that. I think he provides good evidence for that. But in my experience, I've experimented a lot with opium, and I've never had the kind of experience described in the text when you read the descriptions of what happened at Eleusis to the individuals, how they felt, what they saw. That kind of thing never happened to me on opium. But I'm open to the possibility that maybe it's true for other people. But LSD, sure, you know, and granted, ergot isn't LSD, but
yeah, interesting. What about on the same sort of veins of finding out about psychedelics in ancient past? You know, when you went into the alchemical research and found sort of some of the older alchemists and the psychedelics along with them, what was that journey of research like, going down that whole road?
That's what started all of this. So I started using psychedelics very early. Around age 11 was when I first had my first acid trip, and shortly after got into mushrooms, found out they grew, you know, out here in Mississippi and cow fields. So, you know, I learned how to identify them and pick them. And it absolutely changed my life. I didn't know what worship meant or was until I got my hands on psychedelics. So it became a real focus for me in terms of experience and in terms of research. And DMT was always kind of the holy grail of psychedelic for us. We had never seen it. We'd only read about it. And the descriptions of the experience were so just like mushrooms, you know, times 1,000. It is the way it seemed from the literature. And it almost, it kind of is, but at it. And finally, I learned that it's in the root of various acacia species. So we got our hands on some acacia. We followed the simple extraction method that was provided by Jim DeCorn in his book. And we're left with, relatively pure DMT crystals, and began pretty heavy experimentation with it. And that was what made me take a step back and say, what I'm experiencing, I have no is blowing the mind.
Oh, hang on a sec.
There's
hang on a sec, Danny. We missed. You got all garbly there for a sec. So when you said it was the point when you took a step back and you were experiencing, and then it went.
I took a step back because I had no real frame of reference for what I was experiencing, and I thought I need to find kind of a guide, or at least a tradition that I can get involved with that might have something that I can, use to make sense of what I was experiencing on DMT.
Did you describe that? Did you describe it a couple seconds ago? Did you describe what had happened on DMT?
The experiences were.
I guess it got all garbled up, and I thought
I didn't describe it. No, I didn't get into exactly what happened with. But the experiences were ego death. What's classically described as ego death, encounter with apparently intelligent entities. The classic DMT stuff. Yeah. And so I realized I needed to kind of find a tradition. I saw, did I black out again? I saw you guys disappear for a second.
No, it's okay. Yeah, we can still hear you. Yeah, we can still hear you.
Okay, you're frozen on my end.
Yeah, we can still hear you.
But okay, well, I'll keep going. So the tradition that is most visible to me here, sorry.
You're okay.
Yeah.
Why don't we give it a second and see if...
Yeah, sure. You could try turning the video off.
I've got full bars on my end, so I don't know if it's my connection.
You're good now, I'd say.
Okay. So are you...
Maybe not. Famous last words.
Maybe try turning your video off. See if that helps.
See. Do I do that? Stop cam?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it's better.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So I had gotten to a point where I realized I needed a guide or a tradition that could help me kind of develop a context for what I was experiencing. And the most visible tradition like that around here in Mississippi is Freemasonry. And I had an idea of Freemasonry and what it could be from, different occult authors that I had read. And I wasn't going there expecting to find psychedelics, in any capacity. I was going there to try and get a framework, a context to interpret what I was experiencing from psychedelics. So I petitioned to join Masonry. I never expected to be accepted, but I was. And I went through the 3 degrees, and it was in the 3rd degree, the Master Mason degree, where you're going through this profound, death and rebirth ritual, but right there, central to the ritual and really central to the whole structure, is the sprig of acacia. And I'm thinking, there's no possible way that, this is a synchronicity. I've encountered the acacia, but, I put it in the back of my mind thinking, this is confirmation bias, meet it on its own terms. Don't think this is about psychedelics. And I never questioned it again. And in Masonry, I really got involved. I was so fascinated by the rituals and by the teachings. So I started reading every different version of rituals that I could find from every country and from different rites. And it wasn't long before I found a book on what's called the Egyptian rite of Freemasonry by an alchemist named Cagliostro.
Yep.
And in it, he says in no uncertain terms that the candidate undergoing the initiation, that he is drinking a concoction of acacia. And he's saying this in the 1700s. So you got to remember the language that he has to use. But he's saying that it's going to basically it's going to raise his awareness so that he can understand what's about to happen and what's about to happen to him. Basically, in our terminology, he's saying this is going to expand your consciousness. It's going to make you experience what's about to happen to you differently. And he tells him that it's acacia, and that what acacia is the primal matter of alchemy. And that from the primal matter, the alchemists create or extract the philosopher's stone. And what happens after that is he tells the candidate that after drinking it, he's going to have an encounter with angels. He's going to see angels. And, I had been having the same experience with DMT, encountering entities. I didn't interpret them as angels, but you got to think, somebody from the 1700s with no context for psychedelics, they would have interpreted this experience very much in terms of revelation, of what they had access to, of Ezekiel and John of Patmos. And so for them, they thought it was angels. And that's what really started me on this journey to try and understand what early Masonry looked like, what early alchemy looked like, how that alchemic tradition fed into Masonry. And it just turned into being far more than I ever could have expected. And also it was an organic process. I didn't go there looking for psychedelics, but psychedelics led me there. So it also felt kind of divinely orchestrated in a way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, the alchemists, I thought they used to say that intention was the number one ingredient in a way to make alchemy happen. So maybe that psychedelic stuff helped that out.
That's possible. Yeah. I know, Jung, he has an interpretation of alchemy that's very different than what practical laboratory alchemists see as what they're doing. But I think in his model, that's certainly true, that, the unconscious mind, the conscious intentions that are set, all of that plays into the result.
Can we switch gears a little bit about theurgy and maybe the risks of making contact with anything, or like even Blavatsky warned about not being initiated and playing around with stuff, even yoga, that kind of stuff. But also the example I heard you talk about that I don't think our listeners have heard yet, or many of them, would be that experience that the Theosophists had with one of the guys that did a ritual or a ceremony, and something happened, and it caused a big kerfuffle.
Oh, sure. That's George Felt, who was a very important figure in the early days of Theosophy. So there are two Theosophical societies. They're the same group of people, but when they first formed, the goal was practical work. So they're actually wanting to do magic. They're actually wanting to encounter angels and demons and work with them. And George felt, he was a chemist, and he had, what he told Blavatsky and Olcott was he had discovered this substance that would make everyone who encountered it, who used it, be able to see the elementals and see these spirits. And so they get everybody together, and he burns this unknown drug. We don't know what it was, but he burns it on some charcoal, like on an incense tab, and immediately everyone in the room sees all of these spirits that Olcott says they looked as terrible as the demons in Francis Barrett's The Magus, which has pictures of various goetic demons that are kind of therianthropic. They're part animal, part human, and they're grotesque looking. But he says that that everyone saw them, and it put everyone in a panic. And it was such a panic that Blavatsky then created what John Patrick Davini calls the Second Theosophical Society. And this was a society who was meant to be purely speculative, only reading the literature, but not actually doing the stuff described. And that's the event you're describing, right?
Yeah. So that was back when was that back towards the beginning of the Theosophical Society then?
In the very
then?
early days, yeah. And when they met and decided to form the society, there was a woman there named Emma Britton, very fascinating figure in the early days of Theosophy and in the spiritualist movement. But she had written a text. It was attributed to someone else, her husband, I believe, but she had actually written it. And it's called Art Magic. And this was meant to be the textbook of the Theosophical Society. And in there, she gives the earliest description of psychedelic mushrooms anywhere. So right off the bat, she talks about nitrous oxide, opium, cannabis, all these different substances that can be used to induce the trance condition, as she calls it. And she also says the acrid distillations of 2 or 3 species of acrid fungi, something like that is how she puts it. So yeah, there were two societies, and the first one is the one that found themselves face to face with goetic demons.
So is that maybe why Blavatsky sort of warned a little bit about, like, don't play around with this stuff unless you know what you're doing? Or
that's exactly why. Yeah.
And do you agree with that?
Yes and no. It depends on the tradition. There are some traditions where you're interacting directly with a number of powerful spirits, and you don't do those rituals. You don't. A good example is Halomayombe, a Congo tradition that was preserved and developed in Cuba. You don't go invoking these spirits or working with them unless you have licencia, and you have to have a license to work with them. And they immediately recognize if you don't have license, and they do have the power to harm you if you approach them as though you have the authority to command them or call on them when you really don't.
Right.
So that's the difference is, some of these traditions, there are initiations in place that serve to instill the individual with that authority, with that license. And for those who don't have that, you're playing with fire, trying to manipulate these spirits in the way that someone who has license to do so can.
Yeah, yeah. What do you think about the kind of wanted to ask you a couple big picture questions. Like, there's a resurgence back to Christianity, but along with that, which I think is in some ways a positive thing, but along with that, there seems to also be this, and I don't know if you've come across it at all, but a kind of a wave of like the new age is evil again, and you know, magic is evil, and like just not taking symbolism for what it is that can be used for good or evil, or rituals, you know, can be used for good or evil. So there seems to be like a weird resurgence against some of this stuff too. Like, have you noticed that at all?
Sure. You know, in Christianity, there isn't just one Christianity. You know,
Yeah,
there
yeah, that's
are thousands upon thousands of different sects that all think they're the right one. But when you look at the activities of the earliest Christians, um, the the Orthodox and the Proto-Orthodox, there is no shortage of magic going on.
yeah, yeah.
Um, there are Coptic texts that are specifically Christian, you know, that are calling on any number of spirits for any number of reasons, including getting sexual partners. You know, these, you look at the older texts and it's clear that this has always been a part of it.
Would have been considered black magic, you know, nowadays.
That's right. It would have been, and you, you know, the trend to return to Christianity. See, I'm a perennialist, and you know, so I believe that the divine has revealed itself in a number of ways to a number of different cultures in different ways, you know, in ways that those people understand and can interact with. But I still believe that many of these traditions are divinely inspired, do stem from legitimate revelation. But I'm also a traditionalist in that I do believe there's power present in these ancient traditional religions. There's something there beyond just the magical components. But what I'd like to really point out is that what's happening, for example, at the divine liturgy in Christianity, in the Mass, that's an act of magic, but they don't identify it as magic. But they're talking about turning a substance, a food stuff, into the body of God and consuming it, to be one with Him. Now, that's an act of magic. The minute you do the same thing outside of the context in which that activity is intended to occur, which is in the church during the liturgical ritual, that becomes magic. And it's the same in voodoo. You look at voodoo in Haiti, you have voodoo priestesses, mambos, and you have priests called ungan. They are clearly doing magic, and it's okay because it's within the context of the voodoo religion. Now, the minute someone who isn't a priest or a priestess does those same rituals, does those same things, it's immediately labeled like witchcraft, black magic. It's dangerous. And part of that danger comes from what we talked about earlier, not having license to do it. And the minute you involve someone else in that, it's not just you're putting in danger, but the person you're purporting to be doing this ritual for. You know, the person who's hired you to bring them luck or a good job or whatever, you know. So the distinction between religion and magic is a very flimsy one. And I think it's important to recognize, you know, the magical elements of religion and the religious elements of magic. And I do think they have their place. And again, there's something to be said for why they have their place. But pointing fingers and saying what you're doing is evil or black magic, when literally every Sunday they're turning food and God and eating him. You know, that's the kettle calling the pot. You know.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. Yeah, I would agree. That's interesting. Yeah.
PD, this has been great. Is there anything you feel like we missed or we didn't get to yet?
No, I mean we've touched on my new book. We talked about my earlier research. No, y'all have been great hosts. Asked all the right questions.
Yeah, this has been fun. Yeah, we'll keep in touch, and if we come down and do a mound tour or something, we'll let you know.
Yeah, please do. I'd love to see you. And if you make it to Mississippi, there's some real beauties I can take you to out here.
Right on.
PD, where can people find all your stuff? Where can they get the books? Where are you on any social media they can follow you on?
Yeah, the books are available at any major bookseller. You can get them on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, even Walmart, Kmart. You know, they're all over the place. And if you want to get in touch with me, I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and X, Twitter, and I'm under my name on each one of those, PD Newman. So if you want to reach out, have any questions, feel free. I love to, get knee deep into this stuff with whoever wants to talk about it.
Awesome, buddy. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks,
man.
Come back anytime.
Thank you.
All right. Ciao. And that was a chat with PD Newman, tripping on the trail of ghosts. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna get. I think it's out on audio. I think I'm gonna get a couple of these audiobooks. His other one looks good. Theurgy, Theory and Practice: The Mysteries of the Ancient. The Mysteries of the Ascent to the Divine. It's quite fascinating stuff.
Yeah,
I meant to ask him about his trip to Yorkshire too. I think he was in Skipton, where my mom was born.
Really?
Yeah.
Where's Skipton? By Yorkshire?
Yeah, it's like the last. I think it's like up in North Yorkshire. Yeah.
Is that up north or south?
I think it's north. I
Like
think
North UK.
No, North Yorkshire, which is middle. I think the middle of the UK.
The middle.
In there,
the middle of the island.
Yeah.
You cunts.
Yeah, this is good. I'll put links to all this stuff in the show notes.
Well, big thanks to PD for coming on the show. Big thanks to you guys for listening. Hey, even bigger thanks if you're one of the few who do choose to support us over at grimerica.ca/support. If you're getting some value from our little podcast, head over there, send some value back our way. Let us know what it's worth to you. Is it $1, $2, $10, 50 cents? You decide. Sign up for a monthly or make a one-time donation. While you're there, check out our other podcast, GrimericaOutlawed.ca, a little more controversial. Contact@thecabin.com for trips and events. Adultbrain.ca for audiobooks and ebooks and print books and publishing books if you want to publish a book. And Grimerica CBD for all your CBD and just some THC stuff there too, some gummies, stuff like that. And of course, Grimerica.ca/rooms if you want to get all psychedelic like we were talking about and maybe talk to God. So other than that, we love you guys. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next week.